A rusted cage sat abandoned on a frozen Chicago sidewalk. A handwritten sign zip-tied to the bars read, "For sale." Inside, a German shepherd mother curled around her two trembling puppies, their fur crusted with ice, their eyes too exhausted to plead. Hundreds of people walked past without a second glance. But one woman stopped. A Navy SEAL in winter camouflage utilities, a soldier who'd survived too much to ignore another soul left to die. She knelt in the snow, face to face with the shivering mother, and something in both of them, something caged and priced and forgotten, broke open and began to heal. What happened next will remind you that some missions don't end when you come home. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you are listening from. Let's begin. Allison carried the cage with both hands, her arms burning from the awkward weight distribution, the rusted metal biting through her gloves. The mother dog stayed motionless inside, her body still curved around the puppies like a living shield. They didn't whimper, didn't cry, just pressed closer to her warmth with the kind of silence that comes from learning that noise brings consequences. The man in the stained parka had already disappeared into the foot traffic, swallowed by the city's indifference, and Allison felt the familiar tactical assessment running through her mind. Middleman, not the source. Someone else owned these dogs. Someone else had put them here. Someone else was going to notice they were gone. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the immediate problem. Getting 3 half-frozen animals somewhere safe before her truck got towed, or someone decided $200 wasn't enough. "Excuse me." Allison turned. A woman stood in the doorway of a small cafe, steam rising from the interior behind her. She was maybe 50, round-faced and sharp-eyed, wearing an apron dusted with flour. Her name tag read Maria. "You need help with that?" Maria asked, already moving toward her with a stack of clean dish towels. "I've got it," Allison said automatically, the way she always did. "Sure you do." Maria tucked the towels around the cage's edges anyway, covering the gaps where wind cut through. "But you're gonna need these more than I do. Keep them." Allison opened her mouth to refuse, to say she didn't need charity, but Maria was already stepping back with the kind of efficiency that said the decision was made. "That guy you paid?" Maria said quietly, glancing down the sidewalk. "He's been hanging around here for 3 days. Different cages, different animals. Always the same setup." She met Allison's eyes. "Those people don't like losing their property. You should know that." "Noted," Allison said. Maria studied her for a moment. The uniform, the posture, the way Allison held the cage like she was securing an asset under fire. "You military?" "Was. My brother was Army. Iraq, 2004. Maria's expression softened just slightly. "He used to say the hard part wasn't the war. It was coming home and trying to remember why anything mattered." She nodded toward the cage. "Looks like you just remembered." Allison didn't trust herself to respond, so she just nodded and turned toward the parking garage 2 blocks away where she'd left her truck that morning. The walk felt longer than it should have. Every face in the crowd became a potential threat. Every slowing car became surveillance. She cataloged exits, blind spots, choke points, the same way she used to assess Kandahar marketplaces and Helmand province villages. Except this wasn't a war zone. This was Chicago, and the cargo she was protecting wasn't military intelligence or high-value targets. It was 3 lives the world had already written off as worthless. Her truck, a weathered Ford F-150 with rust climbing the wheel wells and a dent in the tailgate from a previous life she didn't talk about, sat in its spot covered in a thin layer of snow. Allison unlocked it one-handed, placed the cage carefully in the back seat, and secured it with a bungee cord from the truck bed. The mother dog watched her through the bars. Not with hope, not with trust, just with the exhausted calculation of a creature trying to determine if this new human would hurt less than the last ones. Allison climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, engine off. In the rearview mirror, she could see the cage, the frost-dusted fur, the puppy's small bodies rising and falling with breath. She'd carried wounded teammates out of firefights. She'd extracted assets under hostile fire. She'd completed missions that required her to lock every emotion in a box and throw away the key. But sitting in her cold truck with 3 dogs who didn't know if she was rescue or just another kind of danger, Allison felt something she hadn't felt in 4 months. Terrified, not of the traffickers, not of retaliation, but of the possibility that she might actually care about something again, and that caring might break her in ways combat never could. She turned the key. The engine coughed to life. "All right," she said to the mirror, to the dogs, to herself. "Let's go home." Whatever that meant anymore. The apartment was on the third floor of a converted brownstone, accessed through a narrow stairwell that smelled like old radiators and someone else's cooking. Allison carried the cage up one flight at a time, her hip protesting from the kneeling earlier, her arms shaking by the second landing. The mother dog shifted her weight with each step, trying to keep the puppy steady, and Allison found herself whispering, "Almost there," like it mattered, like the dog could understand anything beyond pain and survival. The studio was exactly what 4 months of administrative leave and a security deposit looked like. Bare walls, a futon that doubled as a couch, a card table with one chair, a kitchenette with 2 plates and 1 mug. No photos, no decorations, nothing that suggested permanence or the belief that she'd be here long enough to make it matter. The only personal items were a sea bag in the corner, still half-packed, and a locked case under the futon that held her sidearm and the paperwork from the investigation she wasn't supposed to talk about. It looked like a barracks, like a transit point, like somewhere you waited for orders that might never come. Allison set the cage down in the middle of the floor, her arms trembling from exertion and something else she didn't want to name. She opened the door slowly, carefully, and stepped back. "You're safe," she said. "You can come out." The mother dog, Winter, Allison decided, because that's what she looked like, all frost and endurance, didn't move. Her amber eyes tracked Allison's every breath, every shift in posture, calculating threat levels the way Allison herself had been trained to do. The puppies whimpered softly, a sound so small it barely carried across the room. Allison pulled the rotisserie chicken she'd bought from the corner store out of the bag, tore off a piece, and placed it on the floor halfway between them. Then she backed up and sat down against the wall, legs crossed, hands visible, making herself as non-threatening as a person could be. Winter didn't move. The puppies, Ember and Ash, she'd call them later, when she allowed herself to believe they'd survive, pressed tighter against their mother's chest. Allison settled in. This was something she knew how to do. In Helmand Province, she'd spent 6 hours lying motionless in a sniper hide waiting for a target to appear. In Kandahar, she'd held position in a crawl space for 9 hours while insurgents searched the building above her. Stillness was a weapon. Patience was survival. So she waited. She didn't check her phone, didn't turn on the TV, didn't move except to breathe. She watched Winter watch her, 2 apex predators assessing each other across a space that felt both infinite and suffocating. An hour passed, then 2. Her hip started screaming. Her lower back seized. She ignored it the way she'd been trained to ignore everything that wasn't mission critical. 3 hours in, one of the puppies, the smaller one, Ash, crawled forward slightly, nose twitching toward the chicken. Winter's head snapped down, a low warning rumble in her chest, and the puppy retreated immediately. Allison didn't move. For hours. The light outside shifted from gray afternoon to the deeper gray of Chicago winter evening. The radiator clanked and hissed. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. And then Winter moved. Not toward the chicken. Toward Allison. 3 careful steps, body low, ears pinned back, every muscle coiled for retreat. She stopped 2 feet away, close enough that Allison could see the scars hidden beneath matted fur, the way her ribs pressed against skin like a topographic map of starvation. Allison tore off another piece of chicken and held it out in her open palm, arm extended, not looking directly at Winter because direct eye contact meant challenge, meant threat. Winter's nose twitched. Her whole body trembled. And then she took it. The contact lasted less than a second. Winter's teeth grazing Allison's palm, the weight of her muzzle pressing briefly against her hand. But it hit Allison like a breaching charge. Something in her chest, something that had been locked and frozen and dead since the day she watched her teammate's body bag loaded onto a transport, cracked open just enough to hurt. Her eyes burned. Her throat closed. Her hands started shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold or exhaustion. Winter retreated back to the cage with the chicken, tore it into smaller pieces, and fed it to her puppies with the kind of desperate, protective tenderness that made Allison have to look away. She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed through the wave of something that felt dangerously close to grief, to relief, to the terrifying realization that she'd just felt something other than numb for the first time in 8 months. Okay, she whispered to the empty room, to the dogs, to herself. Okay. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The knock came at 0700 the next morning, 3 sharp raps that sent Winter scrambling to the back corner of the cage, puppies tucked beneath her. Allison was already awake. She hadn't really slept, just dozed in 20-minute intervals on the futon with one eye on the dogs and her phone within reach. Old habits. She checked the peephole. Mrs. Kowalski stood in the hallway holding a covered pot, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a cardigan that looked hand-knitted and an expression that said she'd already made up her mind about something. Allison opened the door halfway, blocking the view inside. Mrs. Kowalski, is something wrong? You tell me. The older woman's accent was thick, vowels rounded by decades of Polish that never quite left. I hear you coming upstairs yesterday, carrying something heavy. Then I hear nothing all night. No TV, no music, just you walking around like ghost. Her sharp blue eyes flicked past Allison's shoulder. You going to let me in? Or we talk in hallway where Mr. Chun can hear everything? Allison stepped aside. Mrs. Kowalski walked in, took one look at the cage with 3 pairs of eyes staring back at her, and set the pot down on the card table with a heavy thunk. Bigos, she said. Hunter's stew. My grandmother's recipe. You eat, you think better. Then she turned to face Allison fully. Lease says no pets without deposit. I know. Allison kept her voice steady, already calculating how fast she could pack the truck, where else she could go. I can be out by this afternoon. I didn't say that. Mrs. Kowalski moved closer to the cage, slowly, the way someone moves around animals they understand. Winter's ears flicked forward, but she didn't growl. My son, Tomasz, he bring home dog from Iraq. Stray, all bones and fear. Commands say no, but Tommy, he smuggle him home anyway in cargo plane. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried weight. Dog's name was Bruno. Took 6 months before he let anyone but Tommy touch him. Allison said nothing, just watched as Mrs. Kowalski lowered herself carefully onto the floor, joints protesting, until she sat cross-legged 3 feet from the cage. Tommy came back different, she continued, her voice quieter now. Not all at once. Little things first. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't sit with his back to door. Couldn't be in room when TV show had gunshots. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a piece of dried sausage, placed it on the floor near the cage. I didn't know how to help him. I make food. I tell him I love him. I say everything will be okay. But I didn't understand. Not really. Winter's nose twitched toward the sausage, but she didn't move. Bruno understood, Mrs. Kowalski said. Bruno knew what it was like to be in place where everything can hurt you. To come home and not know how to stop being ready for war. She looked up at Allison, and there was something in her eyes that made Allison's chest tighten. Tommy died 3 years after he came home. Pills. I find him with Bruno laying on his chest, like dog was trying to hold him here. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things that didn't need to be said. I see you yesterday, Mrs. Kowalski continued, pushing herself back to standing with a grunt, carrying that cage like it was mission, like if you let go, something important would break. She moved to the door, then paused. You keep dogs. I waive deposit. But you take care of yourself too, yes? Because I already lose my son. I don't want to lose you. Allison's throat was too tight to speak, so she just nodded. Mrs. Kowalski pointed at the pot. Eat. All of it. And tomorrow, you bring dogs downstairs to my apartment. I have old blankets, better bowls. Bruno's things. She opened the door, then looked back one more time. You know what Tommy used to say? He say the hard part about war is not the fighting. Is coming home and trying to remember you are still person who deserves to be saved. Her eyes moved to the cage, to Winter's exhausted, watchful face. I think maybe you and that mama dog, you learning same lesson. The door clicked shut. Allison stood there for a long moment, staring at the pot of Bigos, at the piece of sausage Winter had finally taken when she thought no one was looking, at the small apartment that suddenly felt less like a barracks and more like something that might, eventually, become home. She sat down on the floor. Winter watched her. The puppy slept. And for the first time since she'd knelt in the snow on Michigan Avenue, Allison let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Saving something else meant she was allowed to save herself too. Dr. Ben Harlow's clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a corner store on Division Street, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The sign outside read, Harlow Animal Care, Walk-ins welcome, in faded letters, and through the window Allison could see mismatched chairs in the waiting room and educational posters about heartworm that looked older than she was. She'd called ahead, explained she had 3 dogs that needed to be seen immediately, that she could pay cash, that she understood it was short notice. The voice on the other end, male, tired, but not unkind, had simply said, bring them in. Back door. 15 minutes. Now she stood in the exam room with Winter in her arms, the dog's body rigid with terror, while the puppies huddled in a cardboard box lined with Mrs. Kowalski's blankets. Dr. Harlow was maybe 40, lean and efficient, with the kind of hands that moved with purpose and scars on his forearms that looked like they had stories. He wore scrubs and a wedding ring and the same exhausted alertness Allison saw in her own mirror. He examined Winter in silence for the first 5 minutes, his jaw tightening with each discovery. Then he stepped back and looked at Allison with eyes that had seen too much to soften bad news. She's been bred at least 5 times in the last 3 years, he said flatly. Probably more. Her uterus is damaged. She's got a mammary infection that's gone untreated for weeks, and she's maybe 60% of the body weight she should be. He moved to the puppies, checking their eyes, their mouths, their tiny ribs. These 2 are about 6 weeks old. Weaned too early. Malnourished. And this, he pointed to small scars on Ember's muzzle, barely visible. This is deliberate. Pinch conditioning. Someone's been hurting them on purpose. Allison felt her hands curl into fists. Why? Aggression conditioning. You starve them, hurt them, teach them that pain is constant and trust is weakness. Then you sell them as protection dogs to people who want an animal that bites. First, Dr. Harlow's voice was clinical, but his eyes weren't. It's a black market thing. Military breeds, working lines, high prey drive. They're worth 15 to 20,000 if you can prove they'll attack on command. The room felt smaller suddenly. Colder. Dr. Harlow washed his hands and turned back to face her fully. You're military, he said. It wasn't a question. Navy. Army myself. Medic. Ramadi, 2006. He leaned against the exam table, arms crossed. So I'm going to say this as someone who knows what I'm looking at. That dog is running on fumes and trauma. And so are you. Allison's jaw tightened. I'm fine. No, you're not. You're standing at parade rest in a vet clinic. You checked every exit when you walked in. You haven't made eye contact with me for more than 2 seconds at a time. He nodded toward Winter, who was trembling despite Allison's hands steadying her. She's doing the same thing. Survival mode. Threat assessment. Waiting for the next bad thing because the next bad thing always comes. What's your point? My point is you've got a choice. Dr. Harlow's voice was blunt but not unkind. You can keep both of you in survival mode. Feed her, treat her infections, keep her alive, and that's not nothing. But alive isn't the same as living. Or, he paused, making sure she was listening. You can actually let her heal, which means letting yourself be vulnerable enough to connect with her, which means admitting you're not fine either. Allison looked at Winter, at the way the dog's whole body pressed into her chest like Allison was the only solid thing in a world that had taught her everything could collapse without warning. I don't know how to do that, she said quietly. Neither does she. Dr. Harlow pulled out a prescription pad and started writing. But you've got something she doesn't. Time. The people who did this to her, they're going to come looking. Dogs like this don't get abandoned by accident. They get lost inventory. So the question isn't whether you're both broken. The question is whether you're going to let each other heal, or just survive long enough for someone else to finish the job. He handed her the prescriptions, antibiotics, pain medication, supplements, and a card with a phone number written on the back. That's my cell. You see anything suspicious, anyone asking questions, you call me immediately. His expression was serious now, almost grim. And Lieutenant Commander? Whatever happened that put you on leave? Whatever you think you failed at? These 3 lives right here don't care. They just need you to show up. That's the mission now. Allison took the card, her hand shaking slightly, and nodded. Outside, loading the dogs back into the truck, she realized Dr. Harlow hadn't asked for payment. She also realized he was right. The boot prints appeared on the 3rd morning after the vet visit, pressed deep into the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Allison noticed them immediately when she stepped outside to check the truck. Military-grade treads, Bates, or Danner, size 12 based on the length and width. They started at the sidewalk, moved to the building's entrance, then paced back and forth in a tight pattern for what looked like hours based on the compacted snow. Whoever it was had stood there watching, waiting, studying the building's entry points and sight lines. Allison's pulse didn't spike. Her breathing didn't change. She simply shifted into the headspace she'd lived in for 6 years of deployments. Calm, clinical, already running probability matrices and threat assessments. She took photos with her phone, measured the stride length with her boot, noted the timestamp. Then she went back inside and checked every exterior window for sight lines to her apartment. 2 had direct views. Both were now marked in her mental map as compromised positions. The scratches around her door lock were fresh, thin silver lines in the brass that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had tried the lock, testing it, maybe attempting to pick it before deciding the risk wasn't worth it. Not yet. Allison ran her thumb over the marks, then installed the portable door brace she'd bought on the way home from the clinic, the kind that wedges under the handle and can withstand several 100 pounds of force. Inside, Winter was standing at the window, body rigid, staring down at the street with her ears pinned flat against her skull. It was different from her normal wariness. This was recognition. The low growl rumbling in her chest said she knew what was out there, had been conditioned to fear it, and was waiting for the inevitable. "I see it too," Allison said quietly, moving to stand beside her. She didn't touch the dog. Winter still flinched at unexpected contact, but she positioned herself between the window and the cage where the puppies slept. "They're not getting in. You understand? They're not getting to you." Winter's growl didn't stop, but her eyes flicked briefly to Allison's face before returning to the window. It was the first time she'd looked to Allison for anything other than food. That night, Allison didn't sleep. She sat against the wall facing the door with her phone charging beside her and Dr. Harlow's card in her pocket. Her Sig Sauer P226 was locked in its case under the futon, easily accessible but secured according to regulations she followed even when regulations felt meaningless. She'd done the math. If someone breached the door, she had 4 seconds to reach the case, unlock it, chamber around, and acquire a target. For seconds while protecting 3 animals who couldn't protect themselves. She'd worked with worse margins. At 0237, Winter's growl intensified. Allison heard it before she saw it. The sound of boots on stairs, slow and deliberate, stopping on the landing below. Then silence. Then the creak of someone testing their weight on the next step up. Allison pulled out her phone and texted Dr. Harlow. "Company. Don't come here. Just need it documented." His response came in seconds. "Already calling CPD. Stay inside." The footsteps retreated. A door opened and closed somewhere below. Mr. Chin coming home from his night shift, his timing accidentally perfect. The building settled back into silence. Winter stayed at the window until dawn, her body a coiled spring that never released. Allison stayed against the wall, watching the door, running through contingencies and extraction routes and acceptable levels of force. She wasn't on leave anymore, not really. Leave was what you called it when you were waiting for permission to return to normal life. This wasn't that. This was reconnaissance before engagement. This was the stillness before contact. This was the moment when training stopped being muscle memory and became the only thing standing between life and death. She'd been here before. In Kandahar. In Helmand. In a dozen towns whose names she couldn't pronounce and would never forget. But this time, the mission wasn't about neutralizing a target or securing intelligence. It was about 3 lives that had already been used, discarded, and priced like inventory. 3 lives that someone clearly wanted back. Allison looked at Winter, still vigilant at the window, still guarding her puppies even though her own body was barely holding together. "They think you're property," Allison said quietly. "They're wrong." Winter's ear flicked back, listening. "And when they come, not if, when, they're going to learn the difference between what they think they own and what I'm willing to die protecting." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the boot prints like evidence that had never existed. But Allison had already memorized every detail. She was done waiting. Now she was ready. The blizzard hit Chicago at 1,400 hours with the kind of violence that made the Weather Service use words like life-threatening and shelter in place. Within 2 hours, the streets were impassable, the L trains shut down, and the power grid started failing in rolling waves across the north side. Allison's building lost electricity at 1647, the lights flickering twice before dying completely, leaving only the gray half-light of storm-darkened windows. She'd been prepared. Flashlights, batteries, bottled water, the camping stove she kept in the sea bag for reasons she'd never examined too closely. Winter had been agitated since morning, pacing between the window and the cage, some animal instinct reading the pressure drop as danger. The puppies whimpered in the dark, and Allison found herself speaking to them in the low, steady voice she used to use with her team during pre-mission briefs. Calm, certain, even when certainty was a lie. The knock came at 17:30. Mrs. Kowalski, bundled in 2 sweaters and carrying blankets, a thermos, and a battery-powered lantern that cast wild shadows across the walls. "Heat will go next," she said, already moving inside without waiting for invitation. "We stay together, keep warm. I have soup." She looked at the dogs, at Allison's tactical arrangement of supplies, and nodded approvingly. "You prepare like soldier." "Good." They sat on the floor because it was warmer than the futon, backs against the wall, the lantern between them creating a small circle of light while the storm howled against the windows. Winter had finally settled near Allison's leg, close enough to feel her body heat, but not quite touching. The puppies slept in their box, their breathing soft, and even for the first time since Allison had found them. Mrs. Kowalski poured soup into 2 mugs, the steam rising like ghosts in the cold air. "You don't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "Not much. Because you see something when you close your eyes." Allison's hands tightened around the mug. She hadn't spoken about it. Not to the investigators, not to the therapist the Navy mandated, not to anyone who mattered. But something about the darkness and the storm and the old woman who'd already buried her son made the words come loose. Fallujah. 8 months ago. Classified operation. Extraction of a high-value target. Her voice was flat, clinical, the way she'd been trained to deliver after-action reports. "My swim buddy, Petty Officer Rachel Chun, was on overwatch while I secured the package. Compound was supposed to be clear. Intel said 3 hostiles, all accounted for." She paused, swallowed. "There was a 4th. Came out of nowhere. Rachel called it, took the shot, but her position was compromised. I had the package. I had my orders. Extract the asset, that's the mission." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind screamed. Command said I should have aborted. Should have abandoned the asset to provide backup. Allison's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Rachel died covering my extraction, and I completed the mission. Exactly the way I was trained. Exactly the way the protocol demanded." She looked at her hands. "They investigated me for 9 weeks. Cleared me of wrongdoing, but recommended I take administrative leave. Said I needed to process the psychological impact of choosing mission over teammate." Mrs. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. Just the sound of her breathing and the storm and Winter's soft snoring. "My Tommy," she finally said. "He saved 3 men in Baghdad. Convoy hit by IED, vehicle on fire. He pulled them out one by one while ammunition cooking off inside. Got medal for it. Bronze Star with Valor." She sipped her soup, her eyes distant. "When he come home, I ask him about it. Just once. He say, 'Mama, I saved 3. But there was a 4th. Driver. I couldn't reach him. He never forgive himself for that. The 3 men he saved? They didn't matter to him. Only the one he couldn't." She turned to look at Allison directly, the lantern light catching the tears on her weathered face. "Those 3 men had wives. Had children. Had whole lives because my son made choice in impossible moment. But Tommy, he only see the one he lose." Her hand reached out, gripped Allison's with surprising strength. "You save 3 lives right here. These dogs, they breathing because you choose them. Stop asking if it enough. Stop letting people who never had to choose tell you what choice was right." Her voice broke. "Just let it matter. Please. Before you end up like my son, so busy counting what you lose that you forget to see what you save." The power stayed out through the night. They sat together in the dark, 2 women haunted by different wars, while 3 dogs slept in the fragile safety they'd built. And somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, Allison let herself cry for the first time since Rachel Chin's flag-draped coffin disappeared into a C-130's cargo bay. Winter pressed closer, her body warm against Allison's leg. And that That small gesture of trust from a creature who had every reason not to trust felt like absolution. The cargo van arrived at 0247 hours, its headlights cutting through the blizzard's dying fury as it pulled up directly in front of the building. Allison saw it from her position at the window where she'd been standing for the past 3 hours, ever since Winter had gone rigid with that low, knowing growl that said the threat was no longer theoretical. 3 men exited. The first was large, maybe 6'3", moving with the heavy confidence of someone who'd never met real resistance. The second was wiry, scanning the street with practiced efficiency. The third stayed near the driver's side, and even through the snow Allison could see the slight bulge under his jacket at the 4 o'clock position. Sidearm, probably a Glock based on the print. She didn't hesitate, didn't debate, just moved. "Mrs. Kowalski," she said quietly, already pulling on her boots. The older woman was awake instantly, years of midnight phone calls from the VA having trained her for emergencies. "Take Winter and the puppies into your apartment. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or police. Understand?" Mrs. Kowalski's eyes went wide, but she nodded, already moving. Winter resisted for only a moment before following, some instinct telling her that Allison was moving toward the danger, not away from it. Allison unlocked the gun case with hands that didn't shake, chambered around in her Sig Sauer P226, and tucked it into her waistband at the small of her back. Then she pulled on her Navy working jacket, the one with Lieutenant Commander insignia still visible on the chest, and descended the stairs in near total silence. She heard them before she saw them. The screech of metal on metal as a pry bar forced the exterior door, the crack of the lock giving way, the shuffle of boots on tile as they entered the vestibule. They weren't being quiet. Didn't think they needed to be. Allison stepped into the vestibule as the doors swung shut behind them. 3 men, trapped in an enclosed space with limited exits, their night vision compromised by the sudden transition from storm to building. She'd run this scenario 100 times in training, had executed it twice in combat. "You have 3 seconds to identify yourselves before I treat you as hostile intruders in a residential building." Her voice was cold, level, carrying the kind of command that made men pause despite themselves. 3, 2. The big one laughed. "Lady, you don't want this problem. We're just here for our property. The dogs. Hand them over. We leave. Nobody gets hurt." 1. They rushed her, all 3 at once, which was tactically stupid but numerically overwhelming. Except Allison wasn't where they expected her to be. She'd already moved left, closing distance with the armed one first because he was the primary threat. Her hand was on his wrist before he could clear the holster, twisting, using his forward momentum against him. The snap of his wrist breaking was loud in the enclosed space. His gun hit the floor and Allison kicked it behind her, already pivoting to the second man. Muscle memory. Close quarters combat. The kind the Navy taught when you might need to clear a ship's passageway or a narrow alley in Ramadi. Elbow to solar plexus, knee to groin when he doubled over, then her boot behind his knee to drop him. For seconds, 2 men down. The big one was smarter. He stopped, hands up, eyes calculating whether he could reach her before she reached her weapon. "Don't," Allison said. And this time she did draw the SIG, held it in a 2-handed grip that said she'd done this before and would do it again. On the ground, face down, hands behind your head. "Now." He complied. They all did, eventually, once they realized the woman in the Navy jacket wasn't bluffing and wasn't afraid. Allison zip-tied them with the flex cuffs she kept in her jacket pocket, another habit from another life, and then called 911 with her phone on speaker, never taking her eyes off the 3 men bleeding and cursing on the vestibule floor. "This is Lieutenant Commander Allison Reed, U.S. Navy. I'm at 2847 North Winchester, 3rd floor apartment. I have 3 suspects restrained following attempted home invasion and interstate animal trafficking. 1 suspect has a broken wrist and a confiscated firearm. Requesting immediate CPD response and federal notification." The operator started to ask questions, but Allison heard sirens already, saw the flash of blue and red through the vestibule windows. Someone, probably Mrs. Kowalski or Mr. Chun, had called when they heard the commotion. When the first officers came through the door, weapons drawn, they found Allison kneeling beside the 3 men, her Sig Sauer on the ground beside her ID, hands visible, voice calm. "Lieutenant Commander Reed, These men forced entry into this building to reclaim dogs I removed from an illegal breeding operation 4 days ago. The armed suspect's weapon is behind me. I used appropriate force to neutralize the threat to myself and the building's residents. The lead officer, a woman with sergeant stripes and eyes that had seen enough to recognize the truth when she heard it, lowered her weapon and nodded. "Ma'am, you can stand down. We've got it from here." Allison stood, her legs shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, and looked up at the third-floor window where she knew Winter was watching. The dog's silhouette was visible against Mrs. Kowalski's lamplight, ears forward, body alert. Still protecting, still fighting, just like Allison had promised. The arrests happened fast once the first domino fell. The man with the broken wrist, Marcus Vega, according to his ID, started talking within 2 hours of processing, trading information for a reduced sentence. He gave them the warehouse location in Gary, Indiana, the names of 4 other operators, and the client list that included private military contractors, overseas buyers, and one particularly disturbing entry for a dog-fighting ring in Kentucky. By 0900, FBI and Animal Control had descended on the warehouse. By 1100, they'd recovered 23 dogs in various states of neglect and abuse. German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, Rottweilers, Dobermans, all military or protection breeds, all showing signs of systematic conditioning designed to break their spirits and rebuild them as weapons. 3 were pregnant. 5 were under 8 weeks old. 2 had to be euthanized on site due to injuries too severe to survive transport. Allison watched the news coverage from Mrs. Kowalski's apartment. Winter pressed against her leg on the couch, the puppies, growing stronger now, starting to play with each other, tumbling across the floor. The reporter stood in front of the warehouse, snow still piled high against the chain-link fence, describing it as one of the largest animal trafficking busts in Midwest history. They mentioned her name once. Just once. The investigation began when Lieutenant Commander Allison Reed, a Navy SEAL on administrative leave, intervened to rescue 3 dogs from a Chicago sidewalk and subsequently defended them from recovery attempts by the trafficking organization. No hero narrative. No dramatic music, just the facts, delivered in the flat tone of someone reading an incident report. It was perfect. Her phone rang at 13:30. The number had a Virginia area code she recognized immediately. Captain Morrison, her commanding officer at DevGru. Reed. His voice was formal, measured, the way it always was when delivering official communications. "Your investigation has been closed. The review board concluded your actions during the Fallujah operation were consistent with mission parameters and established protocol. You're cleared for active duty effective immediately. We'd like you back at Dam Neck within 2 weeks for reintegration training." Allison looked at Winter, at the way the dog's breathing had finally settled into something approaching peace, at the scars that were healing but would never fully disappear. "Sir, I need to ask, is there flexibility in that timeline?" A pause. "You're declining reinstatement?" "I'm asking for an extension, sir." 60 days. She took a breath. "I have some things I need to finish here first." The silence stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then Morrison spoke again, and his voice was different. Quieter. Almost human. "Reed, I read the police report from your incident. I also read Dr. Harlow's statement about the dog's condition." Another pause. "My sister runs a dog rescue in Tennessee. She tells me that animals who've been through what those dogs went through, they don't recover in 60 days. They need consistency. They need someone who shows up." "Yes, sir. I also know that operators who've been through what you went through don't recover on a timeline either." He cleared his throat. "The Navy will be here when you're ready. But if you found a mission that matters more right now, then complete it. That's an order." The call ended before she could respond. Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the doorway with tea and the kind of knowing look that said she'd heard every word through the thin walls. "So, you stay." "I stay." Allison reached down to scratch behind Winter's ears, the first time the dog had let her do so without flinching. For a while, anyway. "Good." Mrs. Kowalski set down the tea and settled into her chair with a satisfied nod. "Because that one," she pointed at Winter, "she only just starting to remember what it's like to be dog instead of weapon. And you, Lieutenant Commander, you only just starting to remember what it's like to be person instead of soldier." The evening news ran a follow-up story. 3 men charged with animal trafficking, racketeering, and attempted home invasion. Federal investigation ongoing. 23 dogs in foster care. Rehabilitation expected to take months or years, depending on severity of trauma. They showed footage of the warehouse being cleared, cages being loaded onto trucks, volunteers wrapping dogs in blankets against the cold. They showed one photo of Allison. Her Navy ID photo, formal and distant, and belonging to a version of herself that felt like a stranger now. Winter growled softly at the TV, and Allison turned it off. "It's okay," she said quietly. "That part's over. For both of us." Outside, the Chicago winter was beginning its slow thaw. Icicles dripped from the eaves. Snow melted into slush on the sidewalks. The city was emerging from the storm, damaged but still standing, ready to rebuild. Inside, 3 dogs slept in the warmth, and a woman who'd spent 8 months wondering if she still knew how to care about anything sat on the floor beside them. And for the first time since Fallujah, Allison Reed closed her eyes and didn't see Rachel Chen's body bag. She saw 3 lives that existed because she'd stopped walking, because she'd knelt in the snow, because she'd refused to let the world convince her that broken things weren't worth saving. The mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, snow giving way to rain, giving way to those first impossible days when the sun felt warm instead of cruel. The adoption papers were finalized on a Tuesday in late March, witnessed by Mrs. Kowalski and notarized at the courthouse by a clerk who smiled at the sight of 3 dogs sitting politely in the waiting area, their coats glossy now, their eyes bright. Winter, Ember, Ash. Their names written in ink on documents that made them legally, officially, permanently Allison's. The clerk handed her the certificates and said, "Congratulations on your family," and Allison had to look away because her throat closed around words she didn't have. Dr. Harlow made the offer over coffee at his clinic, surrounded by the sound of dogs barking in the recovery kennels and the smell of antiseptic and hope. "I need someone who understands trauma. Not the textbook kind, the kind that lives in your bones and changes how you see the world." He'd looked at her directly, the way he always did. "You'd be working with the ones other people have given up on. The biters. The shutdown cases. The ones who need someone who knows what it's like to be written off as broken." He'd paused. "It doesn't pay much, but it matters. If that's the kind of thing you're looking for." Allison had said yes before he finished the sentence. Now she knelt in the building's small courtyard, her hands black with soil, helping Mrs. Kowalski plant tulip bulbs in the thawed earth while the dogs played on the grass. Winter moved carefully still, favoring her hind leg on cold days, but she moved. Ember and Ash, no longer puppies, already showing the lean muscle of their working breed heritage, chased each other in circles, their barks high and joyful in a way that made Mrs. Kowalski laugh and wipe her eyes. "Tommy would have liked this," the older woman said quietly, patting soil around a bulb. "He always say that spring is for second chances, for things that survive the winter and decide to grow anyway." Allison didn't respond, just kept digging, but she felt the weight of it. The truth that she'd survived something she hadn't been sure she would. That she'd stopped just surviving and started, tentatively, carefully, living. The apartment had changed. Dog beds in the corners, chew toys scattered across the floor, photos on the walls now. Mrs. Kowalski with the dogs, Dr. Harlow holding Ash after her first round of vaccinations, even one of Allison herself, laughing at something off camera, unguarded in a way she barely recognized. The space no longer looked like a transit point or a barracks. It looked like somewhere a person actually lived. That evening, as twilight turned the Chicago skyline into something almost beautiful, Allison sat on the floor with her back against the futon. Winter lay beside her, head resting heavily in her lap, breathing deep and even. Ember and Ash were tangled together on their shared bed, already asleep. The windows were open, letting in the sound of the city coming alive after winter. Car horns and distant music and voices calling to each other in the warm air. Allison closed her eyes, her hand moving automatically to stroke Winter's ears. For 8 months, this moment, eyes closed, guard down, had meant seeing Rachel Chen's face. The explosion, the radio call, the choice that had fractured everything. But tonight, she didn't see that. She saw a rusted cage on a snowy sidewalk. She saw 3 pairs of eyes, not in returning to the teams, not in proving she could still complete the mission, but in 3 dogs who'd been caged and priced and left to freeze, who taught her that survival wasn't the same as living, and that home wasn't a place you returned to. It was lives you refused to abandon. Lieutenant Commander Allison Reed was home. And for the first time since Fallujah, that was enough.